If you ever see someone with a bleach-stained jumpsuit hauling cleaning supplies at 3 a.m., just walk away. I mean it. Don't ask what they do. Don't get curious about the chemical smell that clings to their skin like a second identity, or that 1,000-yard stare that slides right past you into some middle distance where nightmares live. I still remember the exact moment my life veered into this nightmare, but I'm getting ahead of myself. 8 months ago, I was on my knees in a Detroit apartment, scrubbing brain matter off a wall with a brush that was already disintegrating under the chemical assault. My back screamed from hours bent over, my nose burned despite the mask, and I was silently cursing the landlord who'd waited 3 full weeks to report the funny smell coming from Unit 4B. What was left of Mr. Abernathy had fused with his plaid armchair by the time anyone checked on him. The poor bastard had used a .45, stuck it under his chin, and painted a Rorschach monstrosity across his grandmother's vintage wallpaper. Nothing unusual for me then. Just another Thursday earning hazard pay while trying not to think about how my criminal justice degree, that piece of paper my parents had sacrificed everything for, had somehow led to this. To me with rubber gloves changing colors from blue to rust brown, wondering if I'd ever get the smell out of my nostrils or the images out of my dreams. What made this scene different was what I found behind the bookcase when we moved it to clean the wool. A small spiral symbol drawn in what looked like blood, but wasn't. It was too dark, too viscous, and it didn't flake like dried blood should. It was the same symbol I'd found 3 months earlier at my brother Michael's murder scene, hidden from official documentation. The same symbol I'd noticed at 2 other crime scenes since, all connected to unsolved cases where the official narrative felt wrong. My boss called as I was peeling off my 3rd pair of gloves that day. The latex snapped against my wrist in protest as my phone buzzed. Larry's voice had that tight, pinched quality like he was trying to pass a kidney stone, the same tone he always used when he had to fire someone. "Jordan, you've got a problem," he said, voice tight like he was trying to pass a kidney stone. I immediately knew I was screwed. Larry only used that constipated tone when he was about to fire someone. "What's up?" I asked, peeling off my gloves with a wet snap that punctuated the silence between us. "Insurance adjuster called. Says you were collecting evidence at the Matthews scene, taking samples, asking questions." Each phrase landed like an accusation, each period a nail in my professional coffin. The breath caught in my throat. I was just, "You know the rules." His voice hardened. "We clean. We don't investigate. Police handle that end." "But they missed things," I insisted, heat rising in my chest. The splatter pattern didn't match their theory at all, and my co-worker Kevin's death the week before followed the exact same. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Jordan," Larry barked, cutting me off. "You're fired, effective immediately. Return your equipment tomorrow." The line went dead before I could respond, just like Kevin had gone dead a month earlier. Just like my brother had gone dead 3 years ago on a Detroit sidewalk. Another unsolved case. Another file gathering dust while detectives chased easier convictions. They were all connected. The symbols, the strange black substance, the inexplicable way the local police seemed to actively avoid following obvious leads. I wasn't seeing patterns that weren't there. I was the only one actually looking. A month later, after blowing through my savings and dodging my landlord's increasingly threatening texts, I found the listing on an obscure job board that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. The site was sandwiched between ads for sketchy pharmaceutical trials and third-shift security gigs at abandoned factories. Clean Pro Services, Mississippi. Crime scene technician needed. $3,000 per week. Housing provided. Immediate start. I stared at those numbers until my eyes burned. $3,000 weekly. That was triple my Detroit salary. Red flag number 1, waving frantically in my face. The listing mentioned unique conditions and strict protocols without elaborating. Red flag number 2, practically doing jumping jacks. But my fridge contained nothing but condiment packets stolen from fast food joints. and my bank account had dipped into single digits. Those red flags started looking more pink than crimson when viewed through the lens of impending homelessness. I called the number. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice flat and emotionless, like someone reading off a script with a gun to their head. "Clean Pro Services," she said. "I'm calling about the technician position," I replied, trying to sound professional despite sitting in my boxers surrounded by unpaid bills. "Experience?" she asked, skipping all social niceties. 3 years in Detroit, residential, commercial, and vehicle cleaning. "Good." A pause. "Any psychological issues? Depression, anxiety, visual or auditory hallucinations?" I almost laughed. Who asks that in a job interview? No, why? Some people aren't suited for our particular environment. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the soft sound of breathing. "The bus leaves tomorrow from Detroit Central. Your ticket will be waiting. Arrive by 3 p.m. sharp." That's how I found myself stepping off a Greyhound into the suffocating heat of Greenshore, Mississippi at exactly 3:07 p.m. The temperature hit me like opening an oven, but underneath the heat lay something else. A weird, clammy sensation that settled on my skin like invisible spider webs. The sky sagged low and swollen, the color of an old bruise threatening to burst. I shifted my duffel bag from one sweaty shoulder to the other, feeling oddly watched despite the deserted bus station. It was barely more than a concrete slab with a splintered bench, surrounded by grass so overgrown it rustled and whispered with each hot breeze. The whispers sounded almost like words. Almost. A white van with "Clean Pro" stenciled on the side in fading blue letters idled in the dirt lot, exhaust pipe coughing up little puffs of black smoke. I spotted a woman leaning against the driver's door, watching me with the intensity of a predator sizing up wounded prey. She was tall, maybe 6 feet, and so thin she looked like she'd snap in a strong wind. Her skin was stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, pale as milk except for angry sunburn across her nose and forehead. Her dark hair was yanked back into a ponytail so severe it pulled at the corners of her eyes, giving her a perpetually surprised look. But her eyes themselves, Christ, those eyes. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing through me, like I was already a ghost haunting this miserable bus station. What really made my skin crawl, though, were the scars on her right hand. 4 parallel lines running from knuckles to wrist, puckered and white against her tan skin. They weren't surgical. They weren't accidental. They looked like something had tried to claw its way out from under her skin. Or maybe something had tried to claw its way in. "Jordan Teller?" she asked, voice rough like she'd been gargling gravel. She didn't move from her position, didn't offer a hand, didn't smile. "Yeah. Good. You're late." She turned and climbed into the driver's seat without checking if I followed, the door creaking like it was screaming as she yanked it open. I tossed my bag into the passenger well and climbed in, immediately gagging on the smell. The van's interior reeked of industrial bleach layered over something coppery and sickly sweet, like a hospital room where someone had died and no one had bothered to change the sheets. The back was filled with plastic tubs and spray bottles, mops and scrub brushes, all organized with military precision. As we pulled away, my eyes fixed on a line of small, round holes peppering the side door. They punched clean through the metal, creating sunlit constellations in the dim interior. Someone had tried to patch them with cheap beige filler that didn't match the white paint, making them look like infected sores that refused to heal properly. "What happened there?" I asked, pointing at the holes. The woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Her knuckles turned white, the tendons in her wrists standing out like steel cables under thin skin. "They just appeared one night," she muttered, jaw clenching between words. No one claimed responsibility. The sheriff wrote it off. The holes were perfectly sized for a .22 caliber, and the scatter pattern suggested someone had emptied a full magazine at close range. This wasn't random vandalism. This was someone trying to hit something, or someone, inside the van. Her tone and the muscle jumping in her cheek told me to drop it. so I swallowed my questions and watched as we drove through Greenshore's main strip, if you could call it that. The town looked like it was actively dying, storefront by storefront. Plywood sheets covered more windows than not, their surfaces tagged with fading graffiti. A diner with an old neon sign, a pawn shop with bars on the windows, a liquor store doing brisk business despite the early hour. These were the survivors, clinging to economic life with dirty fingernails. I counted 3 churches in as many blocks, each with some variant of salvation or redemption on their signboards. The faded letters seemed more like threats than promises. We turned down a gravel road that plunged into woods so dense they seemed to swallow sunlight. The trees pressed in from both sides, branches scratching against the van like fingernails. Spanish moss hung from gnarled oak limbs in long gray tendrils that looked like the beards of men who'd been hanged and left to rot. Twice I thought I saw faces watching from between trunks, pale ovals with dark smudges for eyes, but they vanished when I blinked. After 10 minutes of silence broken only by gravel popping under tires and my driver's occasional throat clearing that sounded like she was trying to dislodge something solid, we emerged at a squat cinderblock building the color of a week-old bruise. A sign that had once been white read Clean Pro, but the P was hanging upside down, looking more like a noose than a letter. Inside hit me with a wall of competing smells: industrial bleach, ammonia, disinfectant, all battling against something deeply wrong embedded in the walls themselves. A sour, organic scent like meat left forgotten in a hot car. I fought down my gag reflex while taking in the sad excuse for a reception area. 2 metal folding chairs with torn vinyl seats, a coffee table decorated with water rings and cigarette burns, and magazines so old their cover models had probably died of natural causes by now. Through a doorway with no actual door, I glimpsed a room lined with shelves of chemicals in unmarked containers, bottles of sickly green and cloudy blue liquids, plastic tubs of powders, aerosol cans with faded warning labels, standard cleaning supplies mixed with things I didn't recognize, jars of what looked like salt, bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, small cloth pouches stained dark at the bottom. A door marked "Private" in flaking red paint swung open, and a man emerged who looked like he'd been constructed from spare parts that didn't quite fit together. Tall but stooped, thin but with a pot belly, pale skin that had never seen sun but somehow still managed to look weathered. His watery eyes blinked rapidly behind smudged glasses, and his mustache looked like it had been drawn on with a Sharpie and then partially rubbed off. His name badge read Ross, though the seconds was fading, making it look ominously like Rose. He didn't offer to shake hands. Thank God, because his fingers were stained a chemical yellow that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Instead, he thrust a single sheet of paper at me. The edges were warped by humidity, the text blurred as though it had been copied, then copied again, generation after generation, until the original crispness had been lost to time. "You have to read these," he said. "Memorize them. They're not official, but they're more important than official, if you get my drift." I scanned the 6 lines. 1. Never use the victim's own cleaning supplies. 2. Bleach only after midnight, never before. 3. Burn any blood-soaked rag, never just bag it. 4. Never clean in total silence. 5. If you sense something touch you, don't turn around. 6. Mark the exit with a victim's shoe before leaving. I looked up, waiting for the punchline. This had to be some elaborate hazing ritual for the new guy. But Ross's expression, twisted by anxiety, told me it wasn't. Okay, I said, handing it back. "What's the reasoning behind these?" Ross exchanged a glance with Martha. "Experience," he said finally. "Hard-won experience." I heard a shuffle behind me and turned to see a petite woman with short black hair and bright green eyes that stood out against her pale skin. She offered me a small smile, the first I'd seen since arriving. "Don't worry," she said quietly. "We've all had that same look the first time. It's weird here." She wore the standard jumpsuit, navy blue with the Clean Pro logo. "I'm Sarah Hale. I'm not much of a mentor, but I can show you the ropes." Her tone hinted that Martha wasn't big on the mentoring bit. I nodded, grateful not everyone here was a walking depression. Martha cleared her throat. "New job tomorrow morning, 5 a.m., farmhouse outside of town." She tapped a folder of documents on the desk. Missing persons, suspected homicide. She paused, leveling me with an intense glare. "Whatever you see, keep it to yourself. The sheriff round here likes minimal fuss." Minimal fuss about a family potentially murdered? My gut twisted. But I needed the paycheck. And maybe, though I wouldn't admit it, part of me was still itching to find some grand explanation for my brother's death. For Kevin's death. Like if I just solved enough puzzles, I'd learn the cosmic secret behind cruelty. Sarah showed me to a small trailer behind the building. My housing. It had running water, electricity, and not much else. The walls were thin enough that I could hear crickets breathing outside. That night, lying on a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with gravel, I tried to make sense of the day's events. Those rules kept floating back into my mind. They seemed arbitrary, almost silly, but the gravity with which Ross had delivered them suggested they weren't to be taken lightly. I dreamed of my brother's blood spreading across Detroit pavement, but when I reached to touch it, the blood reached back, forming tiny fingers that tried to pull me in. The farmhouse loomed against the gray morning sky like a decaying tooth. Peeling white paint hung from its siding in curled strips, and the porch steps groaned under our weight as if begging us to turn back. "Gosh, this place is a tetanus shot waiting to happen," I muttered, adjusting my mask higher as the smell hit me. Dust mixed with that unmistakable sweetness of early decomposition. Sarah nudged me sharply with her elbow. "Quiet, Martha's already in a mood." Yellow police tape fluttered from posts around the property, but there wasn't a cruiser in sight, just our clean Pro van and Martha's rusted pickup. "Sheriff's already been and gone," Martha announced, snapping on her thick gloves with practiced efficiency. "We've got clearance, let's move." Inside, blood spatter near the fireplace formed a trail of macabre breadcrumbs leading down the hallway. Family photos stared from the mantel. Father with thin mustache, exhausted-looking mother, 2 kids with forced smiles. I recognized that hollow look in the mother's eyes. My own mom wore the same expression after my brother died, a permanent absence behind her gaze. Gabe pointed at each of us in turn. "Sarah, check the bedrooms. Jordan, you handle the living room. I'll do the kitchen." Martha's outside, calling dispatch. Gabe appeared from the kitchen, nicotine stains yellowing his fingers and perpetual exhaustion lining his face. "Family of 4. Missing 3 days," he said, the cigarette between his lips bobbing with each word. "Neighbors called when the dog wouldn't stop barking. No bodies." He pointed at us like a drill sergeant. "Sarah, bedrooms. Jordan, living room. I'll handle the kitchen." Martha's outside calling dispatch. I nodded, turning to our supplies. That's when I realized my mop was missing, probably still in the van. The hallway where Gabe had gone was empty, and I didn't feel like trudging back outside. That's when I spotted it, a wooden mop leaning against the fireplace brick, a crusty bucket beside it. The father's cleaning supplies. Rule number 1 flashed in my mind. Never use the victim's own cleaning supplies. But I was new, eager to prove myself competent. What difference could it make? Just some arbitrary policy about evidence contamination, right? I grabbed the mop, dunked it in the bucket, and attacked the blood near the fireplace. As I pressed harder on a stubborn spot, the wood beneath me groaned. Not from pressure, but with an almost vocal quality, like someone exhaling after being punched. For a second, I could have sworn the floor rippled beneath my feet, like muscle flexing under skin. Sarah's scream yanked me from my daze. She stumbled backward from a bedroom, nearly colliding with a hallway table. "What is it?" I dropped the mop, hearts racing as I moved toward her. "The kid's mattress," she gasped, pointing with a shaking hand. "There's a hole, blood everywhere inside, and..." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Teeth marks around the edges. Martha materialized behind her like she'd stepped through the wall, face impassive as concrete. "We do the job, that's it," she said flatly. "Any sign of the family?" Sarah shook her head, still pale. "Then get back in there." Martha's tone left no room for argument. After hours of scrubbing, we broke for water in the yard. While Gabe chain-smoked by the van, I found myself drawn to the upstairs windows. Between drags on his third consecutive cigarette, I spotted movement behind the glass. A face pressed against the pane, watching us. The father's face, hollow-eyed and still. I blinked and it vanished. Just a trick of the sunlight on dirty glass. "You see something?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. "No," I lied. "Just tired." We finished around 2, loading the black bags of soiled rags and broken items into the van. Just before leaving, I realized with a jolt that I'd forgotten to discard the father's mop. It still leaned inside by the fireplace, water in the bucket now a deeper red than before. I glanced at the family photograph on the mantel again. The father's pale face seemed to have shifted slightly. His painted eyes focused directly on me. I blinked hard, shook my head, and hurried out. That night in my trailer, I couldn't stop seeing the father's face. Every time I closed my eyes, there he was. The thin mustache, the weary smile, the creases around his eyes that had seen too much. Worse, whenever I glimpsed a reflective surface, my phone screen, the bathroom mirror, even a puddle outside my door, I caught him watching me. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to splash cold water on my face. As I leaned over the tiny bathroom sink, movement flickered in the mirror. My heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't my reflection staring back. It was him, the father. He stood behind me, leaning over my shoulder, eyes empty and mouth slightly open. A whisper like dead leaves scraping concrete. "You're cleaning up." My sins. I whirled around, nearly slipping on the linoleum. The bathroom was empty, just the hum of a broken fan and my own ragged breathing. My reflection was normal again when I dared to look. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. I'd broken rule number 1, and something had noticed. The bleach job at the Bayou Shack was anything but routine. We were told it was a single victim, possible animal attack. But the careful arrangement of gore said otherwise. No alligator I'd ever heard of staged its kills in geometric patterns. "You're on the pantry," Martha instructed, handing me a mask soaked in peppermint oil. "Remember, don't bleach until after midnight. Ever." The emphasis made her sound like a superstitious grandmother warning kids about walking under ladders. By 11 p.m., my back screamed from hours of scrubbing. Sarah was outside working the back porch, and Gabe dozed in a kitchen chair, mask pulled down to accommodate his cigarette habit. The pantry floor still bore a sticky red patch, almost black in my headlamp's beam. It reeked of copper mixed with something sulfurous. My watch read 11:20. Midnight seemed like an arbitrary deadline, probably just old cleaner superstition. Exhaustion clouded my judgment as I poured bleach over the stain, wanting nothing more than to finish early and collapse in my bed. The hiss as bleach hit blood sounded almost vocal, like a whispered warning. I coughed, scrubbing harder. That's when the knocking started. 3 sharp raps from directly beneath the floor, like knuckles on wood. I froze, bleach dripping from my brush. "Gabe?" I called. No answer. The knocks grew louder, each impact sending vibrations through my kneecaps. Then silence. I forced myself to resume scrubbing, my heartbeat drowning out rational thought. "Just pipes," I muttered. "Old houses make noise." The patch gleamed unnatural white when I finished. As I gathered my supplies to leave, movement caught my eye. Wet, dark footprints were appearing on the still damp wood. Not all at once, but one after another, left, right, left, as if invisible feet were walking across the floor. They led straight to the pantry's small closet door. The knob rattled violently, accompanied by desperate scratching from inside. Fight or flight kicked in, but curiosity won. I yanked the door open, bracing for horror. Nothing. just dusty shelves of canned goods and preserves. No footprints continued inside, no hidden trapdoor. But carved into the inside of the door were 4 parallel gouges, fresh, with splinters still hanging from the wood, the kind of marks desperate fingers might make trying to claw their way out. I staggered outside, gulping humid night air like I'd been drowning. "Jordan." Sarah looked up from her work. "What happened?" "You're white as a sheet." "I used bleach before midnight," I admitted. Something's in there now." Her eyes widened. "Shit." She glanced around nervously. "Look, there's a reason for that rule. Bleach before midnight opens something. The chemicals react with residual energy." "Energy?" I repeated numbly. "Death leaves a mark," she whispered, leaning closer. "Violent death leaves a bigger one. And whatever's on the other side, it can sense when we try to erase those marks too early." Paula was obsessed with rule number 3. Burn the blood-soaked rags, never just bag them. Her stocky frame and copper hair were fixtures behind the Clean Pro building, where she kept a metal barrel perpetually stoked with small flames. I'd watch her methodically feed every blood-saturated cloth into the fire, staying until each turned to ash. "They crawl if you don't burn them," she told me once, voice hushed like she was sharing nuclear launch codes. Her weathered face tightened with genuine fear. "I've seen it." I laughed the first time. She didn't. We were tackling a 2-story house rumored to be a former drug den when I witnessed Paula's dedication falter. Blood decorated the living room walls like macabre Jackson Pollock paintings, and the upstairs hallway carpet bore a decaying stain that had soaked through to the subfloor. "Christ, it's like a slaughterhouse in here," Gabe muttered, pulling on his 3rd pair of gloves. Sarah worked beside me, occasionally breaking the grim silence. "If I see one more maggot, I'm opening a bed and breakfast for them." Her dark humor was strangely comforting in the house of horrors. Throughout the night, Paula dutifully collected every saturated rag, taking them outside to her barrel where orange flames leapt into the darkness. But around 3 a.m., exhaustion claimed us all. Paula's movements grew sluggish, her eyes heavy. I saw her toss a half-bloody towel into a black trash bag rather than trek outside again. I should have said something, but bone weariness had seeped into my marrow too, and all I wanted was to finish and collapse into my bed. We left at dawn, the single forgotten rag sealed in its bag in the upstairs hallway. 6 hours later, I returned for final checks. Standard procedure to ensure we hadn't missed anything that could cause problems. The moment I opened the front door, a stench knocked me back a step. Rotten meat mixed with vinegar, so potent my eyes instantly watered. I followed the smell upstairs, my pulse quickening with each step. The black trash bag sat where we'd left it, but something was wrong. Thin crimson threads were sprouting from the plastic, writhing like worms searching for soil. They'd already spread several feet across the floor, clinging to walls, forming an intricate web of living tissue. "Jesus," I whispered, watching them pulse and grow in real time. A noise from downstairs drew my attention. Paula sat slumped against the front door, trembling violently. Her ankle bore tiny puncture wounds where the threads had latched onto her skin. Blood trickled from the perfect circular holes, too neat to be made by any normal object. "I messed up," she kept repeating, rocking back and forth. "I messed up, I messed up." She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. I rushed to help, using a broom handle to fend off the crimson tendrils that reached for us both. They reacted to my touch with a shrill sound, half tea kettle whistle, half fingernails on chalkboard. I grabbed lighter fluid from our supplies, dousing the bag, and set it ablaze. The threads contorted like living things in pain, their movements disturbingly coordinated and deliberate. After that day, Paula was never the same. She limped around the warehouse, cursing under her breath, eyes hollow as empty windows. The bite marks on her ankle never fully healed, always red and inflamed, sometimes weeping a clear fluid that looked too much like the threads for comfort. By now, I'd learned to keep a radio or phone playing whenever we cleaned. Rule number 4 said never clean in total silence, and after the crawling threads incident, I wasn't taking chances. At first, I thought the rule existed to prevent us from hearing ghostly whispers or some other horror movie cliché. The truth, as I discovered, was far worse. We were assigned a filthy row house near the highway, a single occupant's murder scene. Gabe, Sarah, and I arrived late in the evening, having just finished another job across town. Martha stayed behind at headquarters. She'd been weirdly distant lately, like she was planning something or on edge about local authorities. I didn't press her. We set up a small radio on the windowsill, tuned to an oldies station. Temptations, Four Tops, Aretha, musical company while we worked. Everything was routine until the battery died unexpectedly around 2 a.m. Sarah rummaged for spares in her bag. Gabe cursed under his breath. In that hush, I heard it. A faint whisper. I ended her suffering. It sounded so close, as if someone stood right behind me. Another voice joined in. My mother never forgave me. Then more voices layered upon each other like a demonic choir. They hissed confessions and regrets, half of them impossible to decipher. My spine turned to ice. Sarah's face went pale. Gabe dropped the rag he was holding. The voices grew louder, more insistent. The hush felt charged, as if the air itself vibrated with malice. The corners of the room flickered, like a strobe effect. I glimpsed brief flashes of a scene. A man raising a pipe, a woman cowering, blood splattering the walls. Then the man turned and pointed directly at me, lips curled into a sneer. My vision blurred. Nausea swept through me as one whisper cut through the chorus. He died alone because of you. The voice knew about my brother. My stomach flipped, a punch of guilt to the gut. Sarah desperately pawed at the radio, but it was truly dead. Gabe reached for his phone. No signal, battery low. My mind raced. Don't let it stay silent. I did the only thing I could think of. I hummed. A ridiculous, shaky rendition of Row, row, row your boat, voice warbling with fear. My throat felt tight, words barely squeezing past the lump of terror. The disembodied whispers faltered, as if offended by my desperate lullaby. Sarah joined in, awkwardly, tears shining in her eyes. Gabe croaked half a melody under his breath. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we found fresh batteries in a closet. Thankfully not the occupant's brand, rule number 1. The radio crackled to life, and the twisted confessions ceased. But the damage was done. I couldn't unhear what they'd said about my brother. The house knew my guilt, and it fed on it. A week later, we were called to a motel off the main highway. The occupant had been found shot to death, the body already removed, but the room a biohazard. We arrived around 8 p.m. The power in the area was spotty due to a thunderstorm rumbling overhead. Perfect horror movie ambiance. Sarah was absent. Stomach bug, Martha claimed. That left me, Gabe, and Paula, though Paula mostly hovered by the door, her ankle still bandaged and eyes darting nervously around the room. We spread out to do the usual. Remove biohazards, scrub surfaces, sanitize. The radio played in the corner, a local blues station cutting through the sound of rain pounding the tin roof. Then the power went. A huge crack of thunder, a flash of lightning, and the motel plunged into near darkness. The radio popped and died. Gabe cursed. Our flashlights cast jittery beams across the blood-stained carpet. I swallowed, dreading that hush and its whispers. I tried to hum again, but the sound was drowned by the storm's roar. A second flash of lightning illuminated the bed, the bloody sheets, the spatter on the wall. Then total dark. In that darkness, I felt something grip my shoulder, cold, damp, like a drowned hand. I froze, remembering rule number 5. Don't turn around if you're touched. But my reflex betrayed me. My head whipped around to see who, or what, it was. My flashlight caught the face of a rotted figure wearing the same coveralls as me. Half the flesh on its cheek was torn away, revealing glistening teeth in a permanent grin. One eye was a milky orb, the other absent entirely. It reached for me with blackened fingers. I tried to scream, but fear stole my voice. The thing's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the thunder. Its breath hit my face, the stench of old meat and stagnant water. Lightning flashed again, and the figure vanished, but I felt a burning on my shoulder. I pulled down my collar to find 3 raw scratches, oozing blood that stung like acid. Gabe approached, face grim. "I saw something behind you," he said softly. We both knew we couldn't do anything but keep cleaning, keep the job going. But I wondered how many more rules I could break before something broke me. That night, fever ravaged me. The scratches burned like brands, the skin around them turning an angry red, then purple, then a black that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. I dreamed of drowning in a lake of bleach while that rotting thing pulled me down deeper. Sarah returned for the next shift, though she looked tired, dark circles under her eyes. We were assigned to a church on the outskirts of town. The caretaker's body had been found in the pews, blood everywhere, no clear cause of death. The place had an atmosphere like a tomb, musty, forgotten, holy in that way that makes your skin crawl rather than your soul lift. Martha repeated rule number 6 before leaving. Always mark the exit with a victim's shoe. She pointed to a battered pair of loafers lying near the pulpit. "Don't forget," she hissed, tapping them with her boot. Not after what happened to Rodriguez. No one had mentioned a Rodriguez before. I made a mental note to ask Sarah about it later. We worked methodically, scrubbing down pews and altar rails, removing blood-stained carpet sections. Halfway through the cleaning, Gabe made a discovery that chilled my blood. "These aren't the caretaker's shoes," he said, examining the loafers. "Look, size 13. Report said the victim was 5 feet 6 inches. No way he wore boots this big. So whose shoes were they?" We searched for the caretaker's footwear, but found only one torn sneaker near a confession booth. The left shoe was missing entirely. "Maybe someone else died here," Sarah suggested, voice hushed. "Someone they didn't tell us about." Gabe shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We'll use what we've got." He sounded confident, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. As the night wore on, the silence in the church grew heavier, pressing down like a physical weight despite our radio. The saints in the stained glass windows seemed to follow our movements, their painted eyes shifting when we weren't looking directly at them. Finally, we finished. Exhausted and eager to leave, we loaded our gear. Gabe insisted, "We're fine. Let's just skip the shoe ritual this once." We stepped out the main doors and froze. Where the parking lot should be, where our van should be waiting, we saw an endless corridor. Cracked tile floors stretched into darkness. The windows along one wall showed only blackness, not the night sky, not the woods we knew surrounded the church. "What the hell?" Gabe whispered. We stepped forward, drawn by some force we couldn't resist. The door slammed behind us, the sound echoing unnaturally. Sarah tried the handle, locked tight. We had no choice but to walk, but after what felt like miles, we realized we were looping. Every turn led us back to the same point: a battered vending machine, a flickering overhead lamp, a mirror on the wall that showed no reflection, just swirling gray. Panic set in. Sarah's breathing grew shallow. Gabe kicked the wall in frustration, the sound swallowed by the unnatural acoustics of the place. "The shoe," I said suddenly. "We need to mark an exit with the victim's shoe." Gabe rummaged in his bag and produced the torn sneaker we'd found. He wedged it under a nearby door that read "Exit" in peeling letters. Instantly, the corridor seemed to warp, the walls bending inward like reality itself was folding. The door gave way to the actual churchyard, the night sky beyond studded with stars. We stumbled out, disoriented. Behind us, the corridor and the shoe had vanished. The church door stood open, interior dark and silent. No one mentioned it again. Martha gave us a terse nod when we reported back, like we'd done the right thing. That was our first close encounter with the labyrinth, that place between places where the rules of reality frayed at the edges. Paula's misfortune after the crawling threads incident had only worsened. The bite marks on her ankle spread, forming a webwork of inflamed veins that crept up her calf like dark roots. She walked with a pronounced limp, face drawn with constant pain. She told me once, in a hushed confession near the supply closet, that she felt them in her dreams. "They whisper things," she said, eyes darting as if afraid of being overheard. "Horrible things. Ways to hurt people. Ways to bring more of them through." She'd also admitted to breaking rule number 1 on a previous job, using a victim's broom. "That's when it started," she said. "The dreams, the voices, they get louder every night." One evening, we found ourselves at a small suburban home where a domestic dispute had ended in a triple homicide. Paula looked sickly, dark bags under her eyes like bruises, skin waxy and pale. Midway through the cleanup, she began muttering nonsense under her breath. I caught fragments. "Finish it. Kill. Blood. The pattern must be completed." Her voice had changed, deeper, with a hollow quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. She moved differently too, her usual efficiency replaced by jerky, puppet-like motions. She pulled a mop from the victim's closet, another rule break, ignoring my protest. As she swiped at the blood, she started humming a strange tune, off-key and eerie. Then she scrawled something on the wall with her gloved fingertip, a pattern that mirrored the blood spatters we'd just cleaned. She pressed her forehead to it, whispering, "He wants me to finish what was started. The Father said so. The Father is watching. The Father." I remembered the face I'd seen in my mirror after using his mop. Was Paula seeing him too? I tried to pry the mop from her hands, half expecting her to attack me. Her gaze snapped to mine, pupils so dilated I could barely see the iris. For a moment, I thought she'd lunge. Then she collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't sleep," she wailed. "They're always there waiting, showing me things they want me to do." Sarah rushed over, fear plain in her eyes. She helped me lift Paula, who had gone limp, her body hot with fever. Martha arrived minutes later, took one look at Paula, and ordered us to bring her to the van. That was the last I saw of Paula for a while. She was put on indefinite leave, maybe an involuntary hospital stay. No official statement. But the way she raved about the Father, about finishing the blood patterns, told me she'd been lost to whatever twisted presence had attached itself to her. I wondered if that was my fate too, eventually. If the scratches on my shoulder were just the beginning of a longer, darker transformation. I can't pinpoint exactly when my curiosity started outweighing my survival instinct. It was like watching myself from outside my body as I made one bad decision after another. Like screaming at a horror movie character not to go down those basement stairs while knowing they absolutely will. Maybe it was after seeing the Father's face floating in my bathroom mirror at 3 a.m., his lips moving without sound. Maybe it was after wandering that endless church corridor that shouldn't exist. Or maybe it was watching Paula claw at her own ankle until it bled, muttering about them crawling inside her veins. Whatever pushed me over the edge, I started bringing empty specimen vials on jobs. Small ones at first, the kind you could hide in a closed fist. I'd wait until Sarah or Gabe looked away, then quickly scoop up samples from each scene. Not just regular blood, but the blackish fluid that sometimes pooled beneath floorboards or oozed from behind wallpaper. The stuff that didn't look right, didn't move right, didn't smell human. My trailer became a makeshift lab. I installed a deadbolt, covered the single window with aluminum foil, and kept everything in a fishing tackle box hidden under a loose floorboard. Nothing fancy, just a student microscope I bought off eBay, some chemistry test strips lifted from high school supply closets, and a burning need to understand what we were really cleaning up, what we were hiding for the local authorities, what had infected Paula and maybe me. The first time I put a drop of that black fluid under the microscope, my hands trembled so badly I nearly broke the slide. What I saw made my mouth go dry. Under 400 times magnification it moved. Not like bacteria or blood cells should move, with random Brownian motion. but with purpose, with intent. The fluid bubbled unnaturally when I introduced alcohol. When I added salt, it recoiled like a living thing burned by acid. I documented everything in a cheap composition notebook, the kind with the black and white speckled cover. Some nights, I'd watch strange swirling patterns form in petri dishes, spirals and whirls that somehow reminded me of galaxies being born. Other samples contained tiny black specks that pulsated like tiny hearts. One particularly viscous sample changed color under UV light, revealing patterns that looked disturbingly like writing, not in any alphabet I recognized, but too ordered to be random. On the fourth night of my amateur research, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. Unknown number. I answered without thinking, still focused on my notes. Hello? At first, nothing. Then, faint screaming. Multiple voices, distant, like a recording of a crowd in panic. Underneath it all, rhythmic chanting in what might have been Latin or something older. The line cut before I could process what I'd heard. It happened again the next night, and the next. Sometimes I'd let it ring through to voicemail, only to find recordings of static interrupted by moaning. Once a single word repeated, "Stop, stop, stop," in a ragged whisper that sounded like it came from a throat filled with liquid. My heart would hammer against my ribs every time that unknown number flashed on my screen. I started having panic attacks, convinced someone, something, was watching me work. I swear the fluid itself was aware, wanting me to quit prying into secrets not meant for human understanding. But I couldn't stop. My brother's murderer had never been caught. The police had written it off as a random mugging gone wrong, but I knew better. The wound patterns weren't consistent with a knife attack. The blood spatter had formed that same distinctive spiral I now saw in Mississippi crime scenes. There had to be a connection. I just needed evidence. So I kept collecting samples, staying up for days at a time, surviving on gas station coffee and whatever desperate reasoning told me this wasn't completely insane. The chaotic call of forbidden knowledge is more addictive than any drug. It hollows you out while making you feel full of purpose. It isolates you while making you feel special. Chosen. I realized how far I'd fallen one night after cleaning a particularly disturbing scene. A child's bedroom with blood soaked so deeply into the mattress that we had to remove the entire bed. I snuck a vial of the darkest fluid I'd found yet, almost black like oil but thinner, more volatile. Under the microscope, I discovered something that stopped my breath. Tiny organisms swam through the fluid, not cells or bacteria, but geometric shapes with pulsing cores, triangles, squares, hexagons, all moving with undeniable purpose and what I can only call intelligence. They avoided the light of my microscope, clustering in shadows. They interacted with each other, communicating somehow. I stayed up until dawn watching them, my back screaming from hunching over the eyepiece, my eyes burning. I took frantic notes in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic. I couldn't look away. The shapes were building something, a structure of interconnected forms that grew more complex by the hour, like a microscopic city or circuit board. As sunrise filtered through the gaps in my aluminum foil window covering, casting thin blades of light across my cluttered desk, I realized with mounting horror what I was seeing. The organisms had arranged themselves into a familiar pattern, the exact symbol Paula had drawn on the wall before her breakdown, the same configuration I'd seen in the blood spatter at that first farmhouse with the missing family. My hands shook so badly I knocked over a coffee mug as I sealed the sample in a lead-lined box I'd stolen from a dentist's office dumpster. The ceramic shattered against the floor, but I barely heard it over the roaring in my ears. Whatever I'd been watching wasn't just blood or biological material. It was a blueprint, a signal, a message being transmitted through the very substance of violent death. But to whom? And for what purpose? And why did I have the terrible, crawling certainty that it was somehow communicating back to me? That night, I dreamed of my brother for the first time in years. He stood in a field of spirals drawn in dark fluid, his chest bearing the same wound that had killed him. "They're building a door, Jordan," he said, black liquid spilling from his mouth with each word. "And you're the key." Another job, another rotting trailer in the woods. 2 victims this time, a mother and her adult son found in a shockingly violent state. Their bodies had been removed, but the scene was among the worst we'd tackled. Blood soaked into every porous surface, strange symbols carved into the walls, an overpowering stench that penetrated even our masks. It was nearing midnight. Gabe insisted we wait exactly until the stroke of 12 before bleaching. So we did everything else first: bagging, scrubbing, disposing. The radio crackled with an old rock station, the sound tinny but vital. At 11:59, I hovered over the largest blood patch in what had been the son's bedroom. Bleach bottle in hand, I watched Gabe check his phone clock. "Almost," he muttered. 10 more seconds. He gave me a thumbs up at 12 o'clock exactly. I poured the bleach, letting it soak into the floorboards, bracing myself for any weird phenomena: banging, footprints, voices. The stench was vile, a chemical war between bleach and decay. As the bleach pooled, something shifted in the swirling foam. The shape of a tiny body formed, childlike in silhouette. I blinked, thinking it was fatigue or a trick of the light. Then I heard a small voice. "Mommy?" Soft, barely audible over the radio's static. I dropped to my knees, staring in disbelief. The foam child rippled with each breath it took, tiny arms extending as if reaching out. The radio signal deteriorated further, drowning in static that sounded increasingly like distant screams. "Jordan, get back." Gabe's voice cracked as he yanked me backward by my collar. I stumbled, nearly falling as my boot slipped in the bleach. The foam figure collapsed, melting back into formless bubbles that drained between the floorboards. The voice faded with it, leaving only the rain and radio static. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, voice higher than normal. Gabe's face was ashen beneath his usual 5 o'clock shadow. "That's why we wait for midnight," he said, hands visibly shaking as he lit a cigarette despite the chemical fumes around us. "Earlier, and it traps them. Midnight lets them out." "Lets what out?" "Fragments, echoes, things left behind when someone dies wrong." He took a shaky drag. "Notice the report said nothing about a kid." "Then who?" "Check that closet," he interrupted, pointing with his cigarette at a door we hadn't opened yet. $20 says we find something that shouldn't be here." The closet door stuck, swollen from humidity. When it finally gave way, the smell that rushed out nearly dropped me to my knees. Sweet putrid decay concentrated to an impossible degree. Behind paint cans and mothballed clothes sat a small sneaker, child-sized, crusted with what could only be blood. "Not again," I whispered, stomach heaving. "There were 3 victims, not 2. Gabe nodded grimly. "And nobody reported the kid missing. Wonder why?" 3 days after the possession attempt, I was still seeing my brother's face in every reflective surface. I'd catch glimpses of him in chrome faucets, in the side mirrors of the Clean Pro van, in puddles after Mississippi's daily afternoon downpour. Sleep had become a distant memory. I'd doze off only to jerk awake minutes later, convinced someone was whispering my name from inside the walls. So when we arrived at a split-level suburban home, nicer than our usual scenes with its manicured lawn and ceramic garden gnomes, I was already operating on fumes. The details were minimal as always. Single female victim, throat cut in master bathroom, no suspect identified. The sort of personal, intimate violence that spoke of rage rather than practicality. The front hallway still had police tape crossed over it like yellow warning stripes. Gabe ducked under it without a second glance, but I paused, a sudden wave of dizziness washing over me. For a split second, the tape looked like pulsing veins spreading across the doorframe. I blinked hard, and they were just plastic strips again. I was losing it. "You coming?" Sarah asked, concern etched across her forehead. "Yeah," I mumbled, forcing my leaden limbs into motion. Just didn't sleep well. The master bathroom was a nightmare canvas of rust-brown splatter. The sink basin was crusted with what had once been bright red, now turned the color of old pennies. 3 mirrors, the vanity mirror and 2 smaller ones flanking it, were speckled with arterial spray, tiny planetoids of blood suspended in glass galaxies. "Damn it," Sarah whispered, setting down her supply bag. Someone really wanted her dead. Gabe grunted in agreement, already pulling on a second pair of gloves. "Jordan, you start on the mirrors and fixtures. Sarah, help me with the shower and floor tile. The grout's going to be a bitch." I nodded mechanically, reaching for the spray bottles of industrial cleaners we always carried. That's when I noticed. We were short on our usual glass cleaner. The supply run was scheduled for tomorrow, and Martha had forgotten to check inventory before sending us out. My gaze dropped to the cabinet under the sink. In my exhausted state, the solution seemed obvious. There had to be cleaning supplies in the bathroom. The victim's supplies. But what real difference could it make just this once? I'd already broken rules and survived. Mostly. I crouched down, pulled open the cabinet, and found exactly what I needed. A bottle of Windex with a faded label and fingerprint smudges on the handle. I grabbed it without thinking, my brain on autopilot after too many sleepless nights. It wasn't until I'd sprayed the first section of mirror that rule number 1 slammed back into my consciousness. Never use the victim's own cleaning supplies. My hand froze mid-wipe, paper towel suspended against the glass. "Oh damn," I breathed. The reflection in the portion I'd just cleaned shifted. Then another face replaced mine, a middle-aged woman with mouse-brown hair and wide, terrified eyes. A savage gash ran across her throat, split open like an obscene second mouth, jagged-edged and wet. The victim. She stared directly at me through the glass, recognition dawning in her expression. My lungs seized. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink as she crawled forward through the impossible depth of the mirror. Not walking, but moving on all fours like an animal. Blood dripping upward from her wound in defiance of gravity. She pressed blood-streaked palms against the glass from the inside, fingers splaying wide, leaving crimson prints that smeared and tracked like real fluid. Her mouth opened, that terrible mouth in her neck opening too, and a gurgle emerged that might have been an attempt at speech. Dark fluid bubbled from both openings, running down her chin and chest in rivulets that steamed slightly in the cool air beyond the glass. I staggered backward, hip connecting painfully with the edge of the marble countertop. "Gabe!" I tried to shout, but my voice emerged as a strangled whisper. In the mirror, the woman pressed harder, the glass surface bulging outward like a stretched membrane. Her eyes never left mine, not accusing, which might have been easier to bear, but pleading, desperate. Her lips formed syllables I could somehow understand despite the ruined throat that should have made speech impossible. Jordan. My name. My damn name in the voice of the dead. How did she know my name? I retreated until my back slammed into a towel rack, metal bars digging into my spine. The reflection parted like a curtain, the woman's upper body leaning out of the mirror frame, neck wound gaping wider as if offering something to me. Her arm extended impossibly far, fingers stretching toward my face with the deliberate motion of someone who knows exactly what they're reaching for. I felt the brush of cold, wet fingertips against my cheek. Not just a psychic impression or hallucination, but a physical touch that left a smear of something tacky on my skin. Then an unnatural snap reverberated through the bathroom like a rubber band breaking under too much tension. The woman shrieked, a bubbling liquid sound, and was violently yanked backward. She vanished into the depths of the mirror, which cracked in spiderweb lines from center to edge. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold tile floor, gasping for air that suddenly seemed too thin to sustain life. Sarah and Gabe rushed in from the adjoining bedroom, alerted by the noise. "What happened?" Sarah demanded, eyes darting around the bathroom for the source of the sound. I couldn't answer. My tongue felt swollen, unresponsive. All I could do was stare at the mirror, now displaying only my own reflection, pale, terrified, fragmented by the cracks. and the bloody handprint on my cheek that looked less like a human hand and more like some multi-digited thing with too many joints. Jesus, Gabe muttered, spotting the Windex bottle I'd dropped. Did you use that? When I managed a jerky nod, he cursed again, low and vicious. Rule fucking 1, Jordan. The first goddamn rule. I'm sorry, I finally croaked. I wasn't thinking. I was tired and... Get him out of here, Gabe ordered Sarah. I'll finish up. And for fuck's sake, clean that... whatever it is off his face before Martha sees it. That night, alone in my trailer, I covered every reflective surface I could find. I threw a towel over the bathroom mirror, turned my phone screen down, covered the microwave door with newspaper, avoided looking at windows after dark or the chrome fixtures on my ancient refrigerator. But it didn't matter. I woke gasping, clawing at my neck, convinced something was cutting me open from the inside. My fingers came away wet, not with blood, but with tears I didn't remember crying. Paula used to carry salt everywhere, Sarah told me one morning as we inventoried supplies. She handed me a glass shaker with a dented metal top. Keep it. Might save your life someday. I turned it over skeptically. Salt? What is this, supernatural? Local folklore, she explained, not meeting my eyes. Salt creates boundaries they can't cross. Paula sprinkled it around her cleaning station every job. I slipped it into my pocket, mostly to humor her. 24 hours later, I was thanking whatever gods might exist that I had. Our next job took us to a mansion near the swamp, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity that had clearly been grand once but now sat rotting in neglect. The official file described the scene clinically. Single victim, male, 67, signs of wild animal intrusion, organs missing. The reality was a nightmare. The body had been arranged in a precise spiral, key organs removed not in random predatory feeding but with surgical precision. Even Martha seemed disturbed, though she tried to hide it behind her usual stone face. 15 minutes, she ordered. Initial assessment only. Full crew comes at dusk. I drew a salt line across the study doorway before entering. Partly superstition, partly desperation for any protection I could get. The room reeked of copper and that distinctive chemical smell I'd come to associate with the Mississippi murders. While searching for additional biohazards, I opened an antique cabinet in the corner. Inside sat 7 small jars labeled in thick black marker. Kidney number 2, heart number 4, liver number 1, spleen number 5, and so on. Sarah, I called, my voice barely above a whisper. You need to see this. She peered over my shoulder, inhaling sharply. The contents sloshed in dark liquid, some lumps visibly moving like sea creatures in murky water. These numbers, she whispered. These aren't the first. I reached for a jar labeled heart number 4, but Sarah caught my wrist. Don't, she hissed. Whatever's preserving them isn't formaldehyde. Footsteps approached from behind, Martha's distinctive heavy tread. Her face darkened when she saw the open cabinet. Step away, she ordered. Now. Sarah straightened, something hardening in her expression. This is evidence of serial killings, Martha. We need to report this. To who? Martha laughed, a harsh sound like gravel being crushed. The sheriff? The same one who signed off on animal attack in the official report? The same one whose signature is on all the other animal attack reports going back 20 years. I felt sick. You know about this? All of it? Some folks in high places say we hush it up, so we hush. She slammed the cabinet shut with enough force to rattle the jars inside. Now get back to... A crack interrupted her, glass breaking inside the closed cabinet. A sulfurous stench leaked through the seams, making my eyes water instantly. Through the thin gap between cabinet doors, I glimpsed one of the organs, the heart, pulsing rhythmically, beating though disconnected from any body. With each contraction, it leaked black fluid that moved with purpose, forming the same spiral pattern we'd seen at every crime scene. Sarah gagged, backing away. I fumbled for my salt shaker, creating a hasty circle around the cabinet while Martha watched with undisguised disgust. Superstitious bullshit, she muttered, but she didn't cross the line. Rain pelted the windows of another suburban ranch house like tiny fists demanding entry. Another cleaning job with minimal details on the paperwork. Father strangled mother, mother stabbed father, child missing. That clinical description did nothing to prepare us for what we found inside. Blood spattered across nearly every surface in delicate, almost artistic patterns. Not random spatter, but deliberate arcs and whirls that reminded me of the symbols I'd seen under my microscope. By now, Paula was gone. Institutionalized was the official story, though Sarah had heard rumors that she'd been found in her bathroom with her wrists opened and strange symbols carved into her flesh. Gabe was working a different scene with Martha, which left the house to Sarah and me alone. We'd been on edge all night, taking comfort in a battered radio Sarah had brought, its antenna held together with duct tape. It belted out crackly pop hits from the 90s, the cheerful lyrics about love and summer days creating a surreal counterpoint to the dried carnage we were scrubbing from walls. I was on my knees attacking a stubborn stain on the hallway carpet when the radio suddenly cut out mid-chorus. The silence slammed into the room like a physical force. "Shit," Sarah muttered, smacking the radio's side. "Dead battery. You got spares?" I reached for my pack, then remembered. Left them in the van. The house sank into that eerie quiet that seems to have weight and texture, the kind that presses against your eardrums. So to follow rule number 4 and avoid any silence, Sarah started humming immediately, some pop song I vaguely recognized, her voice thin and shaky. She remembered what happened last time with the voices, the confessions. I joined in, off-key and awkward, our discordant duet echoing through empty rooms. But then we heard something else over our desperate melody, a light, playful giggle from somewhere down the hall, childlike, innocent, completely out of place in this house of horrors. The hair on my arms stood up. Sarah's humming faltered, her eyes going wide. "You heard that, right?" I whispered. She nodded, flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. We separated, moving cautiously through the house, checking closets and under furniture. My heart was jackhammering against my ribs with each door I opened. The flashlight cast misshapen shadows that seemed to move just at the edge of the beam. No child. "Nothing in the back bedroom," Sarah called. I was about to respond when the laughter came again, this time directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I spun around, nearly dropping my light. Empty hallway. Then a voice. Not a child's voice at all, but something deeper, smoother, impossibly seductive, whispered from the shadows. "Jordan," it said, my name emerging like silk sliding across bare skin. "You've been searching so hard, haven't you? For answers, for meaning." The voice paused, letting the words sink into my consciousness like hooks. "You can rewrite the past, you know. You can save him." My breath caught in my throat. My brother. The voice knew about my brother. "Save your brother," it continued, gentle and persuasive as a lover's touch. "He doesn't have to die alone in that alley. I can show you how." My chest constricted painfully. Sweat beaded on my forehead, running down into my eyes and stinging. The voice sounded so sincere, so full of compassion and understanding. It knew exactly what kept me awake at night, exactly what I'd give anything to change. If only I could go back. If only I'd answered his call that night instead of letting it go to voicemail because I was too busy with a date. If only I'd been there when he needed me. I didn't realize I was moving until Sarah's flashlight beam caught me, standing motionless in the hallway with tears streaming down my face. "Jordan?" Her voice seemed to come from miles away. "Jordan, talk to me. What's happening?" I couldn't answer. My eyes were fixed on a large mirror at the end of the hallway, an ornate antique thing with a tarnished silver frame. Something was wrong with my reflection. It was smiling, a wide, knowing smile that showed too many teeth, though my actual face was slack with shock. The reflection's eyes gleamed with an inner light that wasn't reflected from Sarah's flashlight. It mouthed words I hadn't spoken. "Come, Let me show you how to fix it all. I felt a pull like nothing I'd ever experienced, like gravity suddenly worked sideways, urging me toward the glass. My feet began moving of their own accord, slow steps toward the mirror. Part of me screamed internally, recognizing the danger. But another part, the part sick with grief and guilt, the part that had spent years imagining scenarios where I could have saved my brother, wanted desperately to believe. The reflection raised its hand, pressing palm out against the inside of the glass like a prisoner at a visitation window. My own hand rose in response, fingers splayed, ready to make contact. Sarah's flashlight clattered to the floor as she lunged forward, grabbing my arm and yanking me backward with surprising strength. I stumbled, falling hard against the opposite wall. The connection broke like a physical snap, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. In the mirror, my reflection's smile twisted into a snarl of pure hatred, eyes now completely black. The glass cracked from within, spiderwebbing outward from where its hand had pressed. Sarah began singing at the top of her lungs, an off-key rendition of "You Are My Sunshine" that seemed to physically pain whatever presence had almost claimed me. The mirror shuddered, then went still, reflecting only our terrified faces. We collapsed on the hallway floor, both panting like we'd run a marathon. My limbs felt leaden, weirdly disconnected from my body. My throat burned as if I'd been screaming, though I hadn't made a sound. It knew, I whispered, voice raw. It knew about my brother, about what happened. Sarah's hand found mine in the semi-darkness, her palm clammy with fear but reassuringly solid. Real. They always know, she said softly. They find the cracks in you, the guilt, the shame, the regrets you can't let go of. That's how they get in. What are they? I asked, hating how my voice broke on the question, sounding childlike and lost. She shook her head, wet hair sticking to her pale cheeks. I don't think we're meant to know. I think knowing the whole truth drives you crazy. Like Paula, like all the others before us. We finished the job in record time, both too terrified to be thorough. I didn't care about Martha's inspection or possible docked pay. I just wanted out of that house with its knowing mirrors and voices that reached directly into my deepest wounds. As we locked up and practically ran to the van, I could have sworn I heard that child's laughter again, following us through the rain. Not from the house, but from everywhere. From the puddles reflecting moonlight, from the van's side mirrors, from the shiny surface of Sarah's raincoat. That night, I dreamed of my brother stepping out of every reflective surface in my trailer, his chest wound gaping and bloodless, his eyes replaced by spiral patterns that spun and spun and spun. You could have saved me, he said, voice wet and wrong. You still can. I woke up soaked in sweat, my right hand pressed against my bathroom mirror so hard the glass had cracked. The next day, Martha and the local police chief cornered me in the warehouse's storage closet. I'd been inventorying supplies when they appeared, blocking the only exit. The chief was nothing like the clean-cut cops on TV. His uniform was rumpled and sweat-stained, his gut hanging over his belt. But his eyes, Christ, his eyes were off. The pupils had expanded so far they nearly erased the iris, turning his gaze into black pinpricks that watched me with predatory focus. Heard you've been asking questions, he drawled, fingering his belt where a nasty-looking hunting knife hung next to his service weapon. Collecting little science experiments. My mouth went desert dry. I don't know what... Cut the bullshit, Martha snapped, shoving a box of sample vials toward me. My hidden collection. We found your stash under the trailer, the notes, the tests. You're digging where you shouldn't. The chief leaned against a shelf of cleaning supplies, his weight making it groan ominously. See, we've had arrangements here for a long time. He picked at his yellowed teeth with a fingernail. Folks round here know better than to stir that particular pot. What are you talking about? My voice sounded thin even to my own ears. He chuckled, a wet sound like phlegm breaking loose. You think these murders are random? You think those fancy rules come from nowhere? He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell whiskey and something metallic, like old pennies on his breath. There's something in these parts, older than the swamps, older than the trees. We keep it fed with what it needs. Let it roam at the edges where nobody important lives. It's better that way. Safer. Martha's shadow flickered against the wall behind her, momentarily stretching and distorting into something with too many limbs and angles that shouldn't exist. I blinked hard, but the image had already corrected itself, so the corruption went all the way up. Some twisted force demanded blood and suffering. The local authorities kept it quiet. Clean Pro employees were cogs in that hush machine, or worse, potential hosts. My protective guilt about my brother roared to life. What if I exposed it all? Saved others from whatever fate awaited them? I threatened to call in outside authorities, FBI, state police, someone beyond local influence. The chief's eyes darkened further, becoming black pools. Martha shook her head. Don't, she said quietly. If you do, everything unravels. The entity won't be contained. If it can't feed quietly, it'll feed loud. We lose more people. Days passed in a nightmarish blur after my confrontation with Martha and the sheriff. I kept working, but was losing my grip on reality. The scratches on my shoulder pulsed with heat that seemed to come from somewhere else, the pain sharpening whenever I thought about exposing what I knew. Sarah tried to encourage me, pressing one of Paula's old salt shakers into my palm one evening. Just in case, she whispered, glancing nervously at the office where Martha was making calls. There was something different about Sarah lately, a knowing look in her eyes, like she'd seen more than she was telling me. How long have you been here, Sarah? I asked suddenly, realizing I knew almost nothing about her. Her eyes darted away. 6 months, but it feels longer. She hesitated, then pulled up her sleeve. 3 parallel scars ran from wrist to elbow, puckered and white against her pale skin. I broke rule number 5 my second week, turned around when I shouldn't have. Managed to get away, but she trailed off, rubbing the scars absently. Why do you stay? I asked, genuinely baffled. Her laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. Same reason as you. What I saw before I turned around. It wasn't just some ghost or monster. She leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. It wore my face, Jordan. My exact face. And I've seen it at every scene since, watching from corners, from reflections, waiting. I can't leave because there's nowhere to go. It would find me. Then the final call came. A decaying plantation house deep in the swamp, miles from any paved road. The caretaker who found it nearly had a heart attack describing the scene. Multiple victims, bodies arranged in bizarre spiral patterns, organs missing. We loaded up the van, a strange sense of finality hanging over us. Sarah joined me, along with Gabe. Martha said she'd arrive separately. The sky overhead was bruised purple with gathering storm clouds. The drive took almost an hour on a bumpy dirt road that seemed to wind back on itself. You feel it too, don't you? Sarah asked quietly as we drove deeper into wilderness. This isn't just another job. Gabe nodded from the driver's seat, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Everything's been leading here. By the time we arrived, the stench of rot was suffocating. Strange shrieks echoed from distant cypress groves, not quite animal, not quite human. The house itself was a rotted husk, pillars half collapsed, paint peeling like diseased skin. The front door stood wide open, as if inviting us in. I saw something move in an upstairs window, a silhouette that vanished when I blinked. My skin prickled with that now familiar sensation of being watched. We gathered our gear. I brought salt, a small trash can for burning rags, and a single victim's shoe we found at the front steps. We follow all the rules, I told Sarah, trying to sound confident. Inside, the walls were riddled with black mold. The foyer floor was sticky with blood congealed in swirling arcs. The stench made me gag behind my mask. The entire house felt alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. One by one, the lamps overhead popped, plunging rooms into half-darkness. We scrambled to set up battery-powered lights, but they flickered too, as if drained by the house itself. The radio in Gabe's hand crackled, then died despite fresh batteries. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We can't let it go silent," she whispered. But it was too late. The hush slithered in, broken only by our frantic breathing and the distant drip of something wet. A door upstairs banged open. Footsteps scuttled across the floor above us, multiple sets, too fast to be human. Sarah muttered a curse, pressing closer to me. We found a corridor leading to what must have once been a grand parlor. More blood spirals decorated the walls, but these weren't random spatter. They'd been applied with something like artistry, finger-painted with deliberate precision. A huge antique mirror dominated the far corner, its ornate gold frame blackened with age and something that looked like burn marks along the edges. As I stared, the reflection shifted slightly, showing angles of the room that didn't match where I was standing. "Guys," I started to say, when Sarah let out a strangled sound halfway between a gasp and a scream. "There's someone here," she whispered, pointing with a trembling finger toward the corner where wall met ceiling. I followed her gaze and felt my blood crystallize in my veins. A figure crouched there in open defiance of gravity. A man in tattered clothes the color of old bloodstains stood in the corner like some giant insect. His limbs were too long, joints articulated wrong, head cocked at an angle that would snap a normal human's neck. He stared at the spiral on the wall below him, seemingly ignoring us. But there was awareness in his stillness, the concentrated focus of a mantis before it strikes. As if sensing our attention, he turned his head with a movement too fluid to be natural. His face emerged from shadow incrementally, revealing features that were almost handsome in a gaunt, starved way. "Here to clean up?" His voice was guttural yet conversational, as if we were contractors he'd been expecting to fix a leaky pipe. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating inside my skull rather than traveling through air. Before any of us could respond, he shifted his weight and dropped from the corner, landing in a crouch that belonged in a nightmare rather than physics class. Then he straightened, unfolding rather than standing, and walked deeper into the house with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a predator in its own territory. He vanished around a corner, but the sound of his movements continued long after he should have hit the exterior wall. Gabe shot me a wild look. Who was that? We followed, but the man was gone. The hush deepened. The walls throbbed as if beating with a heart. My reflection in a broken glass door seemed to twist, whispering, "Welcome to the feast." A hand gripped my shoulder, the same cold sensation as in the motel. I panicked, forgetting rule number 5. I turned. The figure behind me was a ghostly silhouette wearing a torn Clean Pro jumpsuit. My mind reeled. It looked like Sarah, but not quite. The face was decomposed, eyes bulging. She hissed a wet sound, brandishing a gore-stained rag. "Jordan!" The real Sarah's voice came from across the room. I jerked away from the silhouette. It vanished. My shoulder burned, fresh scratches forming where it had touched me. Another rule broken, more damage done. We pressed onward, rounding a corner into a grand hallway. The floor had partially collapsed, revealing a crawl space beneath. That's where we found a horrific sight. A body pinned by debris, wearing a Clean Pro jumpsuit. The face was twisted in death, but I recognized the ID tag. Sarah Hale. My breath stuttered. Sarah, my Sarah, hovered behind me, seeing her own face on the corpse. She moaned, stepping back. I don't understand. That's not possible, I whispered, looking between the dead body and the very alive woman beside me. You're right here. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, fingers tracing a thin scar I'd never noticed before. The first week I was here, she whispered. I broke rule number 5, turned around when something touched me. It tore me apart. Her eyes filled with horrified recognition. They found pieces of me, but not all. Not enough. What are you saying? My voice broke as pieces started clicking together. Why she always wore high-necked shirts. Why she sometimes seemed to know things she shouldn't. They put me back together, she continued, voice hollow. Martha and the sheriff said I was receptive, whatever that means. But I'm not all me anymore. She looked at the corpse. That's the part they couldn't find. The part they replaced with something else. Before I could process this revelation, a figure stepped out of an adjacent doorway. A woman with unnaturally elongated limbs, her features stretched into a perpetual sneer. Her movements were broken, like each joint bent in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow. She pointed at the body, then at Sarah, and laughed, a sound like glass shattering. You smell the same. Her voice echoed as if coming from multiple throats simultaneously. Both. Incomplete. I recognized her from somewhere. A photo in a case file, perhaps, or a missing person report I'd passed over. She had been human once. Now she was something else entirely. Something that moved in the spaces between realities. "Run!" Gabe yelled, shoving both of us forward. We dashed around the corner but found ourselves in an impossible loop of corridors, each door leading to more darkness. Sarah's fingers interlaced with mine, squeezing with desperate strength. I glimpsed the black-eyed man again, always just out of reach, always watching with that same knowing smirk. The house itself seemed to be shifting around us, reconfiguring itself to lead us deeper toward its center. Eventually, we burst into a large foyer dominated by the huge mirror I'd seen earlier. The reflection inside was no normal reflection. I saw every victim from our past scenes, mouths stretched in silent screams, pounding the glass as if trying to break free. The hush roared in my ears like static. The mirror's surface cracked from within, spiderweb lines forming across its face. Then the glass bulged outward. Distorted arms, some decaying, some scaled, some ending in claws instead of hands, reached through the fractures, grasping at the air. Sarah screamed. Gabe swore. I raised my container of salt, flinging handfuls at the mirror. It sizzled where it landed, the limbs recoiling as if burned. But they kept coming, too many to stop. Somewhere in that swirling reflection, I saw my brother's face. Pale, eyes wide with the same expression he must have worn when he died alone in that Detroit alley. A sob tore from my throat. The reflection parted, showing him in his final moments. It felt like the entire house pulsed with my guilt, feeding on it. Sarah hauled me up. "Focus, Jordan." Her voice trembled, but she was determined. She pointed to a battered door behind us. "We can try that way." She tossed me the victim's shoe. "Mark the exit, right?" We sprinted for the door, dodging the grasping limbs emerging from walls and floor. Something latched onto my ankle. A hand half submerged in the floorboards, nails digging into my skin. I kicked free, barely keeping my balance. The corridor ahead twisted like a funhouse mirror. Gabe's body moved in impossible ways, joints bending backward as he pursued us. Behind him, the black-eyed man from earlier walked calmly, smiling like this was all enormously entertaining. "Your turn to clean up," the thing wearing Gabe's face called after us, voice distorted and multi-layered. I clutched the shoe Sarah had given me, a child's sneaker, crusted with old blood. "We have to mark the exit," I gasped, legs burning from exertion. But when I tried to jam it against the door frame, the corridor stretched impossibly, the exit receding further away with each step. The shoe slipped from my sweat-slick fingers, skittering across the warping floor. "No!" I lunged for it, but my limbs felt weighted with lead. The house itself was fighting us, changing its geometry to trap us inside. I heard my name whispered from behind, my brother's voice impossibly clear. "Jordan." When I turned, I saw not Gabe or the black-eyed man, but something far worse. My own reflection stepped out of a mirror on the wall, grinning with too many teeth. My face, but wrong, eyes completely black, expression twisted with malice I'd never felt. "Time to finish what we started," it hissed, voice like grinding glass. It held out a blood-soaked rag. "Your brother was just the beginning, the first doorway, but you'll be the last." Understanding crashed through me like a physical blow. The spiral at my brother's crime scene, the black fluid, the connection I'd been seeking all along. It had never been coincidence. My search for his killer had been orchestrated from the start, drawing me here, to this moment, to this choice. The last I saw was Sarah's terrified face, half submerged in darkness, reaching for me as the corridor collapsed around us. The mirror me pressed the bloody rag against my face, forcing me to breathe in the stench of old death. I don't know how long I floated in that darkness. Time loses meaning when you're nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. But eventually, I felt something, a tug on whatever remained of me. I opened eyes I didn't know I still possessed. I was back in the farmhouse where it all began, where I'd first broken rule number 1 by using the father's mop. Except everything was wrong. Colors too sharp, shadows too deep, angles of the room subtly distorted, and I wasn't alone. The father stood by his fireplace, wearing that tired smile from the family portrait. Behind him, his wife and children, all with hollow eyes, all watching me with the same patient expectation. "You've joined us now," the father said, voice like dry leaves scraping concrete. "You broke the rules. You crossed over." I tried to speak but found I couldn't. Looking down, I realized why. My throat was open, a gaping wound like the woman from the mirror. I was dead, or something worse than dead.